He was a ghost in a suit of armor, a man who had built a wall of ice around his heart the day his wife died. Lorenzo didn't just avoid love. He hated the idea of it, believing that a soft heart was a death sentence in his world. He sat in a cold, marble office, ruling an empire of shadows, and promised his men he would never bring a woman into his house again. He was the boss, the protector, and a single father who spoke to his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, only through expensive gifts and silence. He thought he had everything under control until the school called to say his daughter hadn't spoken a word in class for 3 months. He stormed into the school, ready to buy the building or fire the staff, expecting to see a terrified instructor. Instead, he found a woman who didn't blink when he entered. Sasha sat on a small wooden chair, her dark skin glowing under the harsh classroom lights, looking like the only living thing in a room full of books. She didn't stand up when the most dangerous man in the city walked in. She just pointed to the empty chair across from her. Lorenzo was used to people trembling, but Sasha looked at him with a mix of pity and steel that made his skin crawl. She told him bluntly that his daughter wasn't broken, she was lonely, and no amount of blood money could fix a child's heart. Lorenzo felt a rage he couldn't name, a heat that burned through his frozen exterior. He wanted to scream at her, but for the first time in a decade, he found himself trapped by someone's eyes. He left without saying a word, but the silence in his car felt heavier than it ever had before. Maya didn't want a new doll. She wanted to go back to school to see Miss Sasha, and Lorenzo couldn't understand why. He started watching the security feeds of the school, obsessed with finding a flaw in this woman who had dared to judge him. He saw her kneeling in the dirt with the kids, laughing as if the world wasn't a dark and dangerous place. He saw her give Maya a small, handmade bracelet, and he saw his daughter smile for the first time in 3 years. It felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything he had failed to provide. He decided he needed to evaluate her more closely, convincing himself it was for security reasons. He invited her to the estate for a private tutoring session, telling his guards to stay out of sight. When Sasha arrived at the iron gates, she didn't look impressed by the gold or the marble. She looked sad for the little girl living in a cage. She walked past the statues and the silk curtains as if they were nothing, heading straight for Maya's playroom. Lorenzo watched from the balcony, his heart hammering a rhythm he had forgotten how to feel. He told himself he was just watching a teacher, but he was actually watching a miracle. She was teaching Maya how to paint, and the colors were bright, messy, and loud. Everything Lorenzo's life was not. He stepped into the room, and for a split second, the 3 of them looked like a family. Then his phone buzzed with a message about a shipment gone wrong, and the ice snapped back into place. The danger of his world began to bleed into the quiet corners of the classroom. A rival family had heard that the ice boss had a weakness, a teacher who was getting too close to his daughter. Lorenzo found a black rose pinned to the school door, a clear sign that Sasha was now a target. He realized that by bringing her into his life, he had painted a bullseye on her back. He should have pushed her away, fired her, and sent her across the country to keep her safe. But when he looked at Maya's face, he knew he couldn't take her light away again. He doubled the guards hidden in the trees and stayed awake all night cleaning his gun. One evening, as Sasha was leaving the estate, a black SUV sped toward her on the long driveway. Lorenzo didn't think. He just ran, his expensive shoes skidding on the gravel as he tackled her into the grass. They rolled together, his large frame shielding her from the spray of bullets that shattered his fountain. For a moment, they were breathless, his face inches from hers, the smell of her vanilla perfume mixing with the scent of gunpowder. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw a strange, fierce spark of concern for him. He realized then that he wasn't just protecting his daughter's teacher, he was protecting the only person who made him feel human. He stood up, his eyes turning back into the cold stones of a killer, and vowed that anyone who touched her would burn. He stood in the middle of his ruined garden, holding Sasha's hand to help her up, and he didn't let go. She didn't pull away, even though she knew now exactly what kind of man he was. The unmarried boss had a choice: protect his vow of solitude or protect the woman who had brought color back to his world. He looked at the blood on his sleeve and then at the softness of her face. The war had officially started, but for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. He leaned in and whispered that she wasn't leaving his side again. The twist was simple. He thought he was her protector, but he was actually the one who needed saving. The estate became a beautiful prison, guarded by men with heavy coats and hidden holsters. Sasha wanted to leave, not because she was afraid of the bullets, but because she was afraid of the way Lorenzo looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. He moved her into a guest suite that overlooked the ocean, filling it with books and the finest paints, trying to buy her comfort. But Sasha wasn't for sale. She told him that a cage made of gold is still a cage. Lorenzo grew frustrated because he could command an army of thousands, yet he couldn't command this one woman to like him. He spent his nights in the surveillance room, watching her read to Maya, feeling a hunger for a life he had sworn off a decade ago. The rival family, the Vincenzos, weren't finished. They sent a message by intercepting Sasha's mail and replacing it with photos of her childhood home. Lorenzo realized the reach of his enemies was deeper than he thought, and he felt a cold dread he hadn't felt since his wife's funeral. He didn't tell Sasha about the photos, choosing instead to lie to her face, telling her it was just a routine security check. This lie sat in his chest like a stone, making him short-tempered and distant. He began to stay in his office until dawn, drinking whiskey and planning a strike that would end the threat forever. He thought he was being strong, but Sasha saw through the mask and recognized a man who was terrified of losing again. One rainy afternoon, Maya fell ill with a high fever, screaming for her father, but Lorenzo was in a high-stakes meeting with his captains. Sasha didn't care about the business or the rules. She burst into the boardroom, slamming her hand on the mahogany table. The hardened criminals gasped, reaching for their weapons, but Lorenzo raised a hand to stop them, mesmerized by her courage. She called him a coward for hiding behind his titles while his daughter suffered in a cold room. He followed her out like a scolded dog, leaving his men in a state of shock. That night, they sat on opposite sides of Maya's bed, their hands accidentally brushing as they reached for a damp cloth. The touch felt like electricity, a reminder that they were both alive and desperately lonely. Sasha asked him why he chose this life, and for the first time, Lorenzo didn't give a scripted answer. He told her about the poverty of his youth and the promise he made to never be hungry again. He admitted that his vow to never marry was a way to keep his enemies from having a target. Sasha looked at him and said that a life lived in fear isn't a life at all. For a moment, the boss disappeared, and he was just a man. He almost kissed her, the tension thick enough to break, but a guard knocked on the door to report a breach at the perimeter. The breach was a distraction, a fire set at the edge of the property to draw the guards away. While the men ran toward the flames, a lone assassin slipped through the kitchen entrance. Lorenzo heard the floorboard creak and reacted with the speed of a predator, pushing Sasha and Maya into a hidden panic room. He stayed outside to face the threat alone, unarmed and fueled by raw protective instinct. He fought the intruder in the dark, the sounds of the struggle muffled by the heavy doors of the panic room. Sasha pressed her ear to the steel, praying for a man she was supposed to hate, realizing her heart was no longer her own. When the lights came back on, Lorenzo was standing over the unconscious assassin, his knuckles bloody and his shirt torn. He opened the panic room door, and Maya ran to him, but his eyes were locked on Sasha. She didn't look away in horror. She walked over and wiped the blood from his cheek with her thumb. It was an act of intimacy more powerful than any physical act, a silent acceptance of his darkness. He realized then that he couldn't let her go back to her old life, not just for her safety, but because he was addicted to the way she made him feel. He promised her right then that the Vincenzos would pay for every second of her fear. The twist came at the end of the hour, when Lorenzo discovered a traitor in his own inner circle. His most trusted advisor had been the one providing the layout of the house to the enemies. It wasn't just an outside war, it was a rot from within. He had to decide if he would kill the traitor in front of Sasha or stay the good man she wanted him to be. He chose to lead the traitor away into the woods, but Sasha followed him into the shadows. She saw him hold a gun to the man's head and whispered his name, forcing him to choose between his old code and his new soul. Lorenzo lowered the gun, but he didn't lower his guard. He banished the traitor instead of ending him, a move that his men saw as a sign of weakness. The word spread through the underworld that the ice boss had gone soft because of a woman. This made the atmosphere at the estate even more dangerous, as younger, hungrier men began to eye Lorenzo's throne. Sasha felt the shift in energy. The guards were no longer looking at her with respect, but with resentment. She realized that her presence was dismantling the empire Lorenzo had spent his life building. She told him she had to leave for his own sake, but he blocked the door, his voice a low growl of desperation. He confessed that he had already broken his vow in his heart. He told her that he didn't want a kingdom if she wasn't the queen, a statement that would have been a death warrant if overheard by his rivals. Sasha was torn between her morals and her growing love for this complicated, violent man. She began to see the business not as a choice he made, but as a trap he was born into. She decided to stay, but only on her terms. She would help him find a way out of the life. Lorenzo laughed, a dry and hollow sound, telling her that the only way out of the Mafia was in a pine box. To prove her wrong, Sasha began looking into the family's legal assets, trying to find a path to legitimacy. She discovered that Lorenzo owned a massive shipping company that could be run without the illegal side of the business. While she worked on the books, Lorenzo worked on the streets, trying to negotiate a peace treaty with the Vincenzos. He offered them a portion of his territory in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. The Vincenzos agreed to a meeting at a neutral location, a public pier, but Lorenzo knew it was a trap. He prepared for a massacre, but he didn't tell Sasha, wanting to keep her hands clean of the blood that was about to spill. The day of the meeting, the sun was bright and the air was salty, a cruel contrast to the violence about to unfold. Lorenzo wore a bulletproof vest under his suit, his heart heavy with the weight of the lie he told Sasha. He arrived at the pier and found not just the Vincenzos, but 3 other families who had united against him. They didn't want his territory. They wanted him gone, so they could split the city among themselves. Just as the first shot was fired, a car screeched onto the pier. It was Sasha, who had found his hidden notes and realized what he was walking into. She jumped out of the car, screaming his name, and the entire world seemed to slow down. The crossfire was intense, with splinters flying and metal groaning under the impact of bullets. Lorenzo's men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. In the chaos, Sasha didn't hide. She ran toward Lorenzo, her only thought to get to him. He tackled her behind a stack of shipping crates, screaming at her for being so foolish. She screamed back that she wouldn't let him die alone. In that moment of absolute terror, the walls between them finally collapsed. He kissed her, a desperate, salty kiss that tasted of sweat and survival, a silent promise that if they made it out, everything would change. They managed to escape by jumping into the freezing water of the harbor, swimming under the pier while the gunmen searched above. They spent hours shivering in the dark, cramped space, holding onto each other for warmth. Lorenzo apologized for everything, for the danger, the lies, and the life he led. Sasha told him that she wasn't a victim. She was a woman who had made a choice to love a monster. The vulnerability in his voice broke her heart more than the bullets ever could. When the sun began to set and the sirens of the police echoed in the distance, they knew the old Lorenzo was dead, even if the man was still breathing. They returned to a safe house, not the estate, knowing the main house was no longer secure. Maya was already there, safe with the few guards who remained loyal. As Lorenzo watched the 2 most important people in his life sleep, he realized he had to make the ultimate sacrifice. The twist was that to save them, he had to fake his own death and give up his name, his money, and his power. He began to plan the final act, a way to disappear forever. But he didn't realize that the Vincenzos had a trump card. They had kidnapped Sasha's mother from her home 3 states away. The phone call came at 3 a.m., a cold voice on the other end telling Lorenzo that Sasha's mother would be returned in pieces if he didn't surrender himself by dawn. Sasha woke up to find Lorenzo staring at the phone, his face a mask of pure agony. He didn't want to tell her, but he knew he couldn't hide this. When he broke the news, the scream she let out was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The guilt nearly crushed him. His world had finally touched the one thing Sasha held most dear. He promised her he would bring her mother back, even if he had to burn the whole city to the ground to do it. Lorenzo called in every favor he was owed, contacting people he hadn't spoken to in years. He realized that to win this, he couldn't act like a boss anymore. He had to act like a ghost. He sent Sasha and Maya to a high-security bunker and went into the city alone, armed with nothing but a map and a bag of explosives. He didn't go to the Vincenzo's headquarters. He went to their supply lines, blowing up their warehouses and cutting off their money. He was a one-man wrecking crew, moving through the night like a shadow. He wanted them to feel the same fear they had forced upon his family. As the warehouses burned, the Vincenzos panicked. They moved Sasha's mother to a secondary location, a derelict church on the outskirts of town. Lorenzo was waiting for them. He had anticipated their move, knowing they would go to holy ground out of a twisted sense of tradition. He entered the church through the bell tower, watching from above as the men paced nervously below. He saw Sasha's mother tied to a chair in the center of the aisle, looking terrified but unharmed. He took a deep breath, checked his weapon, and felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't fighting for power anymore. He was fighting for love. The gunfight inside the church was short and brutal. Lorenzo used the shadows and the echoes of the stone walls to confuse his enemies. He moved with a precision that was terrifying to behold, taking down men twice his size with cold efficiency. When he finally reached the altar, the head of the Vincenzo family held a knife to the mother's throat. He told Lorenzo to drop his gun, or she would die. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He dropped the weapon and put his hands up. He told the man that he could have the city, the money, and the throne. He just wanted the woman. The Vincenzo boss laughed, thinking he had won. But he didn't see the laser dot on his chest from a sniper Lorenzo had hired hours before. The sniper shot was perfect, and the threat was neutralized instantly. Lorenzo rushed to untie Sasha's mother, apologizing profusely as she wept into his shoulder. He led her out of the church, but as they reached the doors, a hidden gunman fired one last desperate shot. Lorenzo felt the hot sting in his side, but didn't stop moving. He got her into a car and drove until he was sure they weren't followed. Only when they reached the safe house did he allow himself to collapse. Sasha ran to him, her face pale with terror as she saw the blood soaking through his shirt. While Sasha worked to patch him up, Lorenzo's loyalists arrived with news. The other families, seeing the Vincenzos destroyed, were now fighting each other for the remains. The power vacuum was total, and the police were moving in to arrest everyone involved. This was the perfect opportunity to disappear. Lorenzo told Sasha that they had 1 hour to pack their lives into 3 bags and leave. They would go to a place where no one knew his name, where Maya could go to school without guards, and where Sasha could teach without fear. But the wound in his side was deep, and he was losing consciousness fast. The twist occurred as they reached the private airfield. A black car pulled up, and for a moment, they thought it was the enemy. But it was the police, specifically, a high-ranking detective who had been trying to catch Lorenzo for 20 years. The detective didn't pull a gun. He pulled a folder. He told Lorenzo that he knew everything that happened at the church and that he was willing to let them go. In exchange, Lorenzo had to hand over the keys to his entire digital empire, the bank accounts, the names, and the codes. Lorenzo handed over the folder without a single regret. He was no longer a boss. He was a nobody, and for the first time in his life, he was free. Hour 5. The New Horizon. They landed in a small coastal town in a country where the sun always seemed to be setting. Lorenzo's recovery was slow, his body weary from years of tension and the physical toll of his wounds. He spent his days sitting on a porch, watching Maya play in the sand with local children. He was no longer the ice boss. He was just Enzo, a man who worked on a small fishing boat. Sasha had opened a tiny community center where she taught art to the village kids. The silence that used to haunt him was now filled with the sound of the ocean and Sasha's laughter. They lived a simple life, but to Lorenzo, it felt like he had finally found the gold at the end of a very dark tunnel. However, the past has a way of catching up, even across oceans. One afternoon, Lorenzo saw a man in a sharp suit standing at the edge of the beach, looking out of place among the fishermen. His heart skipped a beat, and he reached for a weapon that was no longer there. He approached the man, ready to do whatever it took to protect his peace. The man wasn't an assassin. He was a lawyer from the old city. He told Lorenzo that despite his efforts to disappear, he was still the legal heir to a massive, legitimate fortune his grandfather had hidden away decades ago. The money was clean, and it was enough to fund the village for 100 years. Lorenzo took the news to Sasha, unsure of what to do. They had finally found peace in poverty, and he feared that money would bring the old ghosts back. Sasha looked at him and said that the money didn't define them anymore. Their choices did. They decided to use the fortune anonymously, building a school and a hospital for the town without ever putting their names on a single brick. It was the ultimate act of redemption. Lorenzo realized that being a boss wasn't about ruling people, but about serving those you love. He felt the weight of his old life finally lift, leaving him light enough to breathe. One evening, as the stars came out, Lorenzo took Sasha to the end of a long wooden pier. He didn't have a diamond ring or a grand speech. He took a simple piece of string and tied it around her finger, reminding her of the bracelet she had given Maya on the day they met. He told her that he had vowed to never marry, but that he was a different man now. He asked her to be his wife, not as a Mafia queen, but as the woman who saved his soul. Sasha cried as she said yes, the waves crashing beneath them in a steady, peaceful rhythm. There were no guards, no guns, and no secrets left between them. The wedding was small, held in the town's tiny chapel with only Maya and a few local friends as witnesses. Maya wore a dress of bright yellow, and she sang a song she had written herself. As Lorenzo stood at the altar, he looked at his daughter and then at his bride. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who lived in a house of stone and ice. He realized that the black teacher hadn't just taught his daughter how to speak, she had taught him how to hear his own heart. The vow he had made to die unmarried was the best promise he had ever broken. The final twist came a year later. A young man arrived in the village, looking for the man who disappeared. Lorenzo met him at the docks, prepared for a fight. But the young man was the son of the traitor Lorenzo had spared in the woods back in the city. He didn't come for revenge. He came to thank him. He told Lorenzo that because he chose mercy that night, the young man's father had changed his ways and was now helping other men leave the crime life. Lorenzo's one act of grace had started a ripple effect he never could have imagined. He realized that his legacy wasn't the empire he built, but the mercy he showed. The story ends with Lorenzo, Sasha, and Maya sitting on the beach as the sun dips below the horizon. Lorenzo picks up a handful of sand and lets it slip through his fingers, a symbol of the power he once held, and happily let go. He puts his arm around Sasha and pulls Maya close. The screen fades to black as the sound of their shared laughter fills the air. The ice boss was gone forever, replaced by a man who finally understood that the greatest power in the world isn't fear, it's the courage to be loved.